that quick intro to DCL. I hope you find these sessions all enjoyable, a learning experience, and I want to introduce Brian Trombley, who many of you know from his many years at DCL. He has recently left to found Ariza, a consulting firm, which he will tell you about. We're obviously still going to be working together, and we wish him and Ariza much good fortune in this new venture. Brian, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, as Mark said, I've spent quite a bit of time, the last almost 10 years at DCL, and just recently decided to move off and do something I've wanted to do for many years. I've been working in publishing technology for 40 years in XML, and before that SGML for many years, and have been working with DITA XML specifically for approximately the last 15 years. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to start up my own company. It's sort of a last hurrah for me. I could have retired, but I'm not going to do that. And I've been blessed with a great partner to start this company up with, Michael Sweet, who I've known for 20 years, and his experience in publishing and XML is pretty strong as well. And we've got a great team of folks that we've been working with for many, many years that are all coming together under the Ariza umbrella. So what we do is we specialize in all aspects of content management. We provide end-to-end solutions for a lot of different industries. I work with associations and scholarly publishers and a lot of companies that are product companies, industrial manufacturing and technology companies that have product documentation or training materials that they need to push out. And DITA has been a big focus in that space for us. So we provide a range of services, advisory services, planning and implementation, support services. We have a good roster of highly skilled specialist resources that can be brought to bear if you have short-term staffing needs or even long-term staffing needs. And we have some pretty good partners. Some of them are partners of DCL, and DCL is certainly a partner of ours. But we have partners that provide platforms and tooling and technologies to support DITA implementations. So you can reach us at www.arizacs.com. I believe the website actually officially launched this morning. So if you're all going there now, I don't think it'll crash, but you never know. In any case, I'd like to now turn this over to Sabine Ocker. Sabine has worked with us on a number of presentations in the past. She's an information architect with Omnicell, and Chris Hill from DCL, who's a technical product manager, and he runs the product development around Harmonizer. Sabine and Chris are going to talk about maximizing reuse after conversion and migration. So how do you actually operationalize that reuse? You know, it's a good idea to clean up and get stuff in a reasonable format going in, and as part of your conversion and migration process, implement some of that reuse, but there's always some extra work that you have to do at the end, and it's important, and Sabine and Chris will share with you their thoughts on how to do that effectively. So over to you, Sabine and Chris.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Well,
You want me to start, Chris, or you want to go and introduce yourself?
well, I'll introduce myself. I'm, as Brian said, technical product manager at DCL, and I've been working for most of my time at DCL on a product called Harmonizer, which is our tool that plays a role in doing this operationalizing activity that Sabine is going to be talking about. And Sabine and I got to know each other really through Harmonizer. Sabine, when I joined the company, was already using Harmonizer and was kind of instrumental in helping me shape the current release and some of the future aspects of the product. So I've enjoyed working with Sabine a great deal. Sabine?
Well, Roll right back at you, Chris. So what Chris is saying in the sort of code speak there is that meant that I had opinions about harmonizers and lots of suggestions and ideas about how to take it to the next level in terms of being just a really effective tool. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of that. My name is Sabine Ocker, and I am recently an information architect at Omnicell, but prior to that, I worked at other organizations and helped them through a large-scale data adoption projects, including conversion and setting up a reuse strategy. And some of you may know me from my previous gig, which was working as a consultant with Don Stevens and the rest of the crew at Comtech Services, where I got to interact with a lot of other clients that were pushing the same rock up the same hill in terms of that migration into a data environment. Okay, well, let's get right into it here. And let's talk about what is it that I'm referring to when I talk about operationalization. Say that 5 times fast. So everyone's familiar with the sort of like strategy side. In order to be able to effectively take your existing content and move it into data reuse mechanisms, you need to define a strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the components of that reuse strategy in a slide here. But then there's the bit about where, it's always easier to write new content in compliance with your reuse strategy and with the content creators having a mind for writing for reuse, and then also finding content that already exists in your content corpus. But the bigger thing that we don't very often talk about is the task of taking your existing content corpus, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, however long your company has been in business, and transforming that content either from its original source or into its converted data topic structure into all of the reuse mechanisms that you've outlined that you're going to use in your reuse strategy, right? So just a high level about what those steps, those operationalization steps are. The first one is really if you get a harmonizer report or if you get some sort of data about a crawler, even if you don't have a CCMS and you've really just had somebody in your organization who's written a script that crawls through your content similar to what Harmonizer does, then you have information about what content in your corpus is duplicate or near duplicate, right? So the first step is a pretty extensive analysis period where you want to really make sure and take a look at that content. And especially the nearly duplicate, right? So things that are a close match, but not 100% match, because you need to determine, is it different accidentally, right? So the person was just using a different phraseology and it really is duplicate content, or is it different on purpose, right? And then is there another way that you might be able to handle just those differences? If it's mostly the chunk of content is mostly duplicated, but only has a couple of strings that are different, can you make those strings into a variable? Can you conditionalize those strings? So those are some of the tasks that are part of that analysis and to determine the disposition, right? So you want to take a look at that content and any data that you have and just determine, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to make it into a reusable topic? And what's leveled, we'll talk a little bit about the leveling that you want to do, but determine disposition. And then I'll reorganize and rewrite the content to continue the flow and to utilize that new reuse mechanism, or perhaps the variables or the conditions, and then go through the nuts and bolts of whatever CCMS or authoring tool that you're utilizing to actually make it into a content reference. Or a variable or a condition. So some considerations, and considerations are the sort of things that you might find that could be a challenge, right? Also things that may play a very important role in your organization. So what is the timing? When does it make the most sense? So some of this can be done without having a knowledge of the content set, but some of it you have to engage the writers. So considering the pragmatic reality that the publishing trains don't stop, right? So writers have to continue to deliver their deliverables. So try to think about it. We'll talk about what are the two must-haves for your operationalization, successful operationalization, and that is a plan, right? So when does it make the most sense to execute against your plan, and how much can your writers help, right? Like what percentage of their time can you have, and do you have access to the potential to hire contractors or interns or shoemakers, elves, or whoever you've got lined up to help you with this process. And then also to think about what's that scalability, what's that maturation, right? Like what if you do that you discover new reuse scenarios as you move along? So how are you going to be able to iterate or scale your reuse strategy? And then also really get to know your reuse strategies, right? So are you sharing content across organizations in your company? At Omnicell, that's something that's very important to us. We're actively working towards collaborating on reusing of procedural information, sharing between our training organization and our technical service organization for troubleshooting content. So make sure that you understand what are those business cases and the scenarios in which case you're going to be asking writers to create reusable objects. Do you have, global library assets like your copyright, your legalese stuff that you can use? Do writers share or reuse content very often between the various publications in their product set? Right, so those are all different kinds of scenarios and therefore might have different sorts of operationalization requirements. And then also, again, I kind of alluded to this, differentiate between what does one writer need between all of the publications that they create or responsible for. What are all a small set of writers who are all collaborating on a single product or a single product line? What kind of reuse scenarios do they need? And then also, what are your global reuse strategies, right? So you heard me mention about your copyright, your anything that's legalese, any cautions and warning statements that you might include, support information, or your address of your company. All of those kinds of things could potentially be part of your global library of reused content. Okay, Marianne, can you change the next? Okay, great. So here's the two things. Now I could talk for the entire 45 minutes on just the sort of must-haves and drill down into the details of all of the things that I think are important to have lined up. Now remember, I'm German, so I believe that your closet should be in order and that you should have all of the little things you need, definitely need, might need, and just in case stuff. And understanding, of course, that that's not always possible. But I've narrowed it down to just two things that I think are absolutely must have. And one is to have a plan, right? So to be able to, just like you would plan for your conversion and plan for your releases, you also have to plan for your reuse. How are you going to implement your reuse strategy, right? So the timing, I already spoke about that. What is the scope? You have this ginormous content corpus, but a lot of companies, including the ones that I've worked for, they're like, we're not investing in all of our content corpus. So remembering what are the things that are your highest priority or your highest value content, and focusing on scoping your reuse operationalization into just that important and valuable content. And also the prioritization, right? So making sure that when you have a content inventory, and I'll talk about that, that you can say, these are our priority products, these are the priority publications and content within those product lines. And then also have a tracking mechanism, and that's why I'm going to talk about the inventory and why it is also on the must-have list, is because you need to have this is not something where you can pull a switch and then it's going to be done. You need to be able to track and measure your progress against against that execution. And then also, if possible, have metrics. And metrics also bring up a good point, because it may be, again, thinking about maturation, thinking about progress and scalability over time. And it may be that you will say, this is our minimal viable product for our reuse, right? We're only going to create content references, and we're only going to define our variables, and we're not even going to worry about conditionalization until phase 2, and then we're going to take a look at things like content push and other kinds of more advanced reuse mechanisms. So again, having those metrics of the percentage of your content that's in your minimal viable product, and then the percentage of your prioritized or scoped content that you're ready to go to the next phase with. And then also what resources, where get those shoemakers elves lined up to work from midnight to 5 a.m. So the content inventory, I left this one second because it's actually something that if you've attended the session of mine, then you've heard me talk about how important an inventory is. And here's yet another context in which an inventory is really important. So make sure that your inventory is comprehensive. Include anything that's on your delivery platform, even if your org doesn't own it, because someone's going to ask you about it. And then you'll be able to say, well, we're not converting this, we're not reusing this, we're not doing this, because simply we don't own it, or that you negotiate with the other ownership and bring it under your umbrella. Assign a priority and a disposition, right? So again, that scoping, that priority, you identify your high value content, and then you prioritize that content, work on it first, make sure that it sets the stage for the other things, and making sure you track what is the disposition. What did you decide based on the intelligence that you got about potential duplicate content for each item that's been identified in a particular publication, right? And so also, I'm a big believer, you've got to get buy-in from your stakeholders about your decisions for scoping and prioritization, right? So making sure, planning on vetting this disposition with your product managers and other key stakeholders, right? And it goes without saying, of course, that you're working in close partnership with the actual content authors of this content. Include page count data, just in case a miracle happens, and that you can continue to outsource and get vendors to help you with the post-conversion reuse. You want to make sure that you have as much information about any given piece of content in your content corpus that you can share with whoever needs it or might need it. And then also track your identified reusable content. So one other thing that I want to say about the inventory, and you don't have to go back, Marianne, on the slides, is that this is going to take you longer than you think it's going to. So even if you don't have to get in front of all of your product managers, you should count on at least 3 months to really make sure that your inventory is complete, that it's accurate. If you have to run this past the product stakeholders, count on at least another month or 6 weeks for that, because you have to get on their calendars, and everybody's busy. So again, it's an important asset, and you should invest in it. But just bear in mind that it is a bigger lift than you might imagine. So I'm going to talk about the execution of your reuse strategy, some housekeeping details, right? So these are some things we always think about the reuse strategy, and we understand at a high level that means you're going to decide which of the lots of DITA reuse mechanisms that you're going to use, and then how are you going to get there from where you are now. But some finer level granularity of details that I want to make you aware of is a sort of the notion of your ID. So especially at Omnicell, where our reuse strategy encompasses not only our own organization of information development, but also our training partners and our technical services. So we need an ID naming convention. Our CCMS takes care of all of the nuts and bolts about the IDs, but the humans have to have them be meaningful. So when content creators are looking for content to reuse, or that they're sharing content across departments, those IDs need to make sense. So keep that in mind, that you'll need to have an ID naming strategy as part of your overall reuse strategy. decide if you're going to just use warehouse or library topics. Are you going to just have one big topic with everything referenced? Are you going to have a folder that you're going to keep all your individual topics? And then also, what is the location of those folders within your CCMS or within your file structure? And then also whether you decide, are variables part of phase 1, are variables a part of phase 2, and to think about what are your needs for those variables. So variables, of course, is a string that has only, you know, a single phrase or a single word that is different. You might want to just, you're going to build a public, if you have partners, right, that's an excellent example, so that you have 2 partners, and so wherever you use their name, you put that in a variable, and then poof pow, you can single source the publications for both of your partner organizations. Content references, okay, we've already talked about that, right? So content reference is the mechanism by which you're going to say, you know, include this content right here, but the content is actually resident in someplace else in its original source form. And then conditionalization. So again, if you have like Omnicell, we have internal and external customers. Some things are appropriate for both, some things are not. So you can take out the internal only content when you're creating a publication that's going to be delivered to your internal only stakeholders, right? So those are some considerations. And then, so there's the when, right? So again, building on that, well, when are we going to tackle this? When are we going to push the waterline down on the iceberg that is our content corpus, and the things that are above the waterline are the things that are in compliance with our various strategies, our information model, our content strategy, our reuse strategy, right? So the function is you want to push that waterline down so that more content is above the surface. So do you want to do that all at once, either pre or post conversion? Unless you're a superhero or you have an entire flock of shoemakers, elves, that's going to be hard to do. So again, think about phasing, think about scalability, think about maturation and levels is a better way, right? So another option for when you tackle this is that as writers work with the content. So writers are pushing out releases on a regular cadence, right? So at Omnicell, that's biannually. So as writers are preparing to add their new content, that's a good time for them to take a look at the content and then deploy or implement your reuse strategy. Sometimes this can be problematic because writers are focused on their very tight timelines and they have a lot of things to do, and they might say, you know, this is really below the fold for me in terms of my priorities. Then also that reuse operationalization as a regular part of writer capacity, right? So when I've worked at some organizations, I've had to campaign for writer cycles on a regular part of the biannual release cycles. I need to have 20% of every writer cycle as part of taking out the duplicate content and replacing it with content references, creating conditionalizations for single sourcing of content, et cetera, et cetera. And the last bullet is, you know, the things roll downhill. And so it could be that this whole implementation, instantiation of the reuse strategy might fall on your information architect for the bandwidth. And of course, that, you know, is a very practical reality. And then thinking about then if it's just you as the information architect, how are you going to manage to make forward progress on that? Okay, so my next 2 slides, and then I promise, so Chris, you promised me you were going to interrupt me, so I'm waiting for you to interrupt.
I'm waiting for a time when you leave something out, but you're
good.
So far doing great.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk for a couple more slides, and then Chris is going to talk to you guys about the harmonizer report, which you're hearing me alluding to. I'm dangling the carrot before you a couple of times. So my next 2 slides are sort of, there are pros and cons to either approach, right? Like tackling the implementation, instantiation of your reuse strategy, either as before you do the conversion and after you do the conversion. So the title of this is about the after the conversion, but I want to address this sort of, you know, the alternative, which is to tackle it as part of something that you invest in before you're actually having your source content converted into DITA and then migrated into your CCMS if you're also implementing one of them. So some strong pros, right? So the potential content for reuse is easier to locate, right? Because it hasn't been moved into a new tool, into a new path. You can eliminate any content for conversion, right? So remember that inventory where you're going to assign a priority, and it may be that there's some content that the products aren't being sold, nobody's using them, and it might be time to just sort of archive it, right? So you can actually do that process and then get rid of some content that doesn't need to be converted, doesn't need to have that operationalization done to it. And then you can also take that phased approach. Now we're going to do this first before we convert, then we're going to convert, and we're going to do this next. And you can, the writers can use their existing authoring tools, right? So there's a familiarity and a comfort level, and also an increased efficiency and productivity with some of the people that you're going to be tapping to help you with that. Again, here's another carrot. The Harmonizer report will help with that. One thing that I'm going to mention that Chris and I talked about when we were going over this is that one other thing that's a sort of pro about this is that you get the writers used to thinking about reuse, looking for content for reuse, writing content for potential reuse. And that's an important paradigm shift in part of the change management. So that's a pretty big, that's a pretty big pro. You can still do it after the content's been converted, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But you know how that is. Change management can be a challenge, and getting people to think differently helps them build that into the process by which they're going about preparing and creating content for the next release, right? So the oh, sorry, please go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to jump in there. One of the things I've seen in some organizations is, we talk about reuse before or after. It doesn't have to be either or. And sometimes you'll identify, maybe some high priority content or something that's very ripe for reuse to serve as sort of the template or the example for the authors so that they can start to see, this is how we're going to produce this ultimately, because a lot of times if you do that reuse later in the process, you wind up just having the author see it as more work. They don't really see what is the real benefit going to be, or how does this improve my job? And sometimes I've seen organizations really pick that content before conversion that can really serve as that model going forward.
That's a really good point, Chris. Well, thanks for bringing that up, right? So that is a pretty significant. And if I think back about the multiple times that I've either helped companies migrate into DITA or helped Comtech clients migrate to DITA, usually the harmonizers will report somewhere north of 30%, sometimes even up to 50% of potential duplicate content that could be reused. So even if, let's just say, you can only operationalize half of that, so that's very conservative guess. But so that's still 25%, potentially 25% of writer cycles, which are now free, potentially, to do other things, right? So that's an amazing efficiency and amazing potential for increased productivity and efficiency.
Yeah.
So the cons, right? So you might not have those writer resources available. You might not have the expertise, right? You might not even have your strategy defined, much less the shoemakers, elves don't have the skills and the experience that's needed to really do that assessment and do that deep analysis. And again, this can take a while, so it might delay the start of your actual conversion work, right? And then this is an important consideration, and this is the thing that management chains in the two companies that I worked at, they were like, is the source content worth the investment? And the answer generally is no. even though it is kind of a misnomer, right? Because it's garbage in, garbage out. So whether you invest the time before you convert or you invest the time after you convert, you still have to invest the time. But it is pretty clear, I've found in some management, that they really do view this as something that, like, we're just going to focus on the after stuff, not the before stuff. And the definite con is you must focus on the high value content, right? So the implication is, of course, that you know what is that high value content. So that whole work about setting up the inventory, working with product management, getting that buy-in from your stakeholders has to happen before you can get to this, get to this place. So there are, again, pros and cons and considerations. I'm just here sort of, telling you about them as you're weighing what makes the most sense in your own organization, right? Okay, so Marianne, next slide, please. Okay, great. So that was the sort of before you do the conversion stuff. And remember, if you're using a conversion vendor like DCL, for instance, they're going to be doing pattern matching, right? So the more consistent and the more effective and the more work, the investment that you make in that content before you get it converted, the more that it is that DCL or your conversion vendor will be able to help identify the patterns. And if it's clear and you can write, good business rules that if you see this, make it this thing, then they can help, the conversion vendor can help you instantiate your reuse mechanism. And if you don't invest in any of that sort of pre-conversion cleanup work, the chances are that they're going to be able to do meaningful pattern recognition and to be able to implement some percentage of your reuse strategy, goes down, right? So that is something else that's in the consideration bucket. But anyway, let's move on to the reuse after your conversion. All of the things that are on the positive side, right? So working within topics, right? So creating reusable DITA structures like topics or subcomponents of topics, or even at the smallest level phrases or elements, it's easier to do when the content is actually in the topic form, right? DITA does provide multiple reuse mechanisms, right? And there's lots of good information, lots of good training that's available about what are those advanced reuse mechanisms and how you can potentially deploy them in your environment. And then also, your content after conversion is going to be in compliance with your information model, right? So that will take away some of the nuts and boltsy things of making sure that the content that you're reusing is going to fit into the place where you want to reuse it, right? And then also, going through the conversion process gives you insight into your content. Like, for example, for me, when I was working at a company, we were at a distributed environment and everybody was using it, for their file system. So I literally had no way to gain any visibility into the content as a corpus. So going through the conversion process and then migrating the content into the new CCMS provided me with that insight where I could see and identify those potential, right? Like, so the inter publication specific to one writer reuse, that's clear, right? Because they're just doing it. But the inter-writer, inter-product, or global and library, things were more challenging to identify from a nuts and bolts perspective because there wasn't a corpus to look at. And again, there's my carrot. Harmonizer will help, and Chris is going to talk about that. So here's the downsides, right? So you, again, may not have the available resources, and chances are pretty good, usually people view that once the conversion is done and the content is migrated, they're like, okay, we're done, right? So it may be an uphill battle, not only getting the resources, but getting them to be prioritized and making the pitch for why you want to invest. The content may be difficult to locate in the CCMS, right? So depending on what CCMS, and I hope you'll join for that last session where we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons, it might be harder to actually find that content that's been identified as duplicate or potentially duplicate to do that analysis. And again, management may, deprioritize. And I have to tell you, this one got me a couple of times where management were like, I know I said we would revisit this once we're converted, but we really don't have time to do it. So unless you can make it your part-time job to instantiate our reuse strategy, we're moving on, right? And then that becomes a challenge because, right, then you're flowing down to that it becomes the information architect's job. And then your writers may go rogue, right? They may start doing their own reuse and their own conditionalization and setting their own variables and not in compliance with your ID, all the best intentions, right? Sometimes it's always that razor's edge between doing what you got to do to get things done and also wanting to so again, going back to that tracking and measuring will help you identify, hopefully fairly quickly, what are the things that are sort of, happening outside of the bounds of your ID naming conventions, for example. This last one, I feel like I should be making the little sad trombone sound. Wah, wah. Time is not your friend, right? So it's harder, it's easier to keep that momentum. You have, and the build up to this process, right? You have a lot of momentum. Everyone's paying attention. Everyone's excited. Oh my God, we're going to get our content converted. We're going to get a new CCMS and blah, 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 blah. Everyone's excited. But as things move on, people are like, yeah, I forgot all about that reuse, and oh, I have duplicate content. I know I need to deal with it at some point. So again, keeping in mind that really time is not your friend, or can not be your friend. I mean, it depends on your organization, but as human beings, right, we tend to be like the fire in front of us is much more important than the ashes behind us.
That's a really good point. And one of the things I talked about how even if you're going to do a lot of the work after conversion. One of the things I've seen done that I really liked was, again, having that model piece of content. So coming up with that exemplar sort of publication or a set of topics or documents that you can plan ahead of time to serve as a model. So you almost are doing the work on this small set ahead of time, setting it up so that everyone can see very clearly at each phase what you're trying to accomplish. And once that content is all converted over, you have that model to then build on, to begin to pull those topics into other publications, for instance, and show authors, see how quickly you can develop this new release because you're able to leverage all these things. If you can identify that small piece and then shepherd that through, that gives you a way to set expectations, a way to really make sure that you don't lose that momentum post-conversion. Because that is a real problem that you aren't the only one burned by it. I've seen that in most cases, is the best intentions go out the door once we're done with the hard work of the conversion. And conversion can be, it is work. And so once you're done with it, you might, as an organization, be kind of tired and you're ready to breathe.
Yes, that too. And that Chris is bringing up a really good point, because that is definitely one of the pillars of good leadership, no matter what context it's applied, is model the way, right? So making it easier for writers to see, to visually see what that reuse strategy looks like in a real environment, right? So what a fully operationalized piece of content at the publication or whatever level, what it really looks like. And then also to be able to understand better what's the LOE to get there.
And that's hard because a lot of times your organization has no experience with a fully operationalized piece of content. So anyway, as Sabine has advertised, I'm going to jump in here to talk a little bit about Harmonizer and just what it is. So Harmonizer is a pretty straightforward thing. It's not anything too mysterious. What it basically does is it will pull all of the the blocks of text out of your content. And we put it in a giant database, and then we do a massive number of comparisons to try to determine what is the potential for reuse and where are your pieces of content, your paragraphs in this lingo, where are they closely or exactly matched? So if you have, say, a pile of Word documents, maybe some PDFs, some HTML stuff from your knowledge base, you have maybe some old FrameMaker documents, and whatever it is you have, Harmonizer will harmonize that by taking all of it and doing these comparisons, this massive comparison between all of the pieces of the content. And what it provides you with then is a report. And at a high level, we give you a few statistics that are useful in either making a case for reuse to your management or assessing your progress. And here's an example of just some charts that show you a simple example where you've got a piece of content that has, in this case, about 89% of the content is duplicated throughout. And these were a set of sample Word documents that were all based on each other, but they were all in a pile of a repository. And this gave us insight to say, hey, reuse is a really good idea here, because if I've got 89%, even if 20% or even 10% of this gets cleaned up, I'm making some significant impact, especially if I'm factoring in translation costs or just the cost of maintaining this content. If you go to the next slide, you see a little bit of the kind of comparisons that the report shows you. So here it's showing you that there's some content that are exactly matched at the top. So you see some paragraphs that occurred within the content in multiple places. And then you see a hint at the bottom there of how Harmonizer can do close matches. And the close matches are the ones that are really hard to do. So as Sabine mentioned, you could probably get by with a script. You could write a simple script. And that's actually how Harmonizer started. It started as a tool that went through and was basically a script in its, 25 years ago when it started, that we were using to help identify this stuff. And then it's evolved over time into a full-fledged product. And one of the big features of it is it can go in and tell you where are those close matches causing variations in text. And it will find close matches that you can't find through a direct word-by-word comparison. So, for instance, if I told you turn off the power before servicing the machine in one place in your content, and then elsewhere I might say before servicing the machine, you should turn off the power. Those are going to show up as not matches at all if you do a word-by-word comparison, because all the words are inverted. In Harmonizer, it's got a lot of fuzzy logic that can go in and identify those as very closely matched. Now, if you want to see more about Harmonizer, I'm not going to go through a demo today of that, but what I can tell you is that, and if we can go to the next slide while I talk about this, is Harmonizer is available in demo form by me. So all you have to do is reach out to our people at DCL. I'd be glad to set up a demo for you. We also routinely will run demo sets of content. So if you've got a small set, you just want to see your content in context, we routinely do that. And then as a real bonus, at the raffle at the end of this DITA Day, you could win, I think it's $1,000 in DITA bucks, or Harmonizer bucks, or whatever we're calling them. I missed what the word was, but anyway, 100,000 or 1,000 DCL dollars that can be used. I was about to raise that by twofold, but anyway, $1,000, which can get you one of your reports out of the way for sure on some of your content. So to see more about how to do this kind of analysis, and if anything, a demo will help you at least understand what you might want to be thinking about doing on your own, whether or not you use the product. It can give you some guidance there. So I want to now, Sabine, what kinds of things do you want to give us as our marching orders as we all move on and hopefully tackle this reuse problem?
Well, so before I get to the things that keep me up at night, I just want to underscore what Chris is saying about the power of a harmonizer demo. So at both the organizations where I help them migrate to a DITA environment, I asked DCL to run a harmonizer report on a small sample of our content set. And then I used the results of that harmonizer report as a really compelling pitch to my management about why we needed to focus on reuse and also why we needed to have DCL's help in converting our content. So I would say I would advocate for pushing that rock up the hill. You heard me say some of the considerations about management deprioritization, saying to your management, look at this, this small sample of our content. Look at the percentage of duplicate content, how much writer efficiencies we could gain, and how much money we could save with our translation costs and maintenance, and also part of the business driver to migrating to DITA is about that branding of your look and feel. How much more consistent we could make our content if we didn't have, like the example where Chris gave, where it's just like, well, the two sentences have the same meaning but they're not expressed in the same way. A consistency is a really, really important thing. So I would advocate, sorry to put in the pitch, but I would say that it would be a really illuminating experience to have that be done if you haven't already. So again, here's some things that, I'm trying not to make this too much of a cautionary tale because I am in the process of pushing this post-conversion, operationalizing our reuse at Omnicell, that rock up the hill right now. But I do wish personally that I could have new harmonizer reports on a quarterly basis, because it's a lot easier to do analysis against something that's a current content, right? Like I'm trying to do right now, I'm trying to do analysis on harmonizer reporting data that does not currently reflect the state of the content. So there is a little bit of tail chasing that has to go on. And again, tail chasing results in additional cycles for the information architect to be able to get to that disposition state, right? I also feel like this is something that's really important, and you'll hear me and Brian and Magda talk about our experience and what's missing from that in another session. But I need corpus level reporting for my CCMS, right? So to be able to get that data to help with my progress report easily and simply is something that really I think about at night. And then also for me, I need a mechanism as the information architect for formally requesting writer cycles. And even if I have to duke it out with people for the prioritization, a lot of companies like mine don't have a means for making that happen, and I need that to happen, right? And then also everything takes, it's like redoing your house, redesigning your kitchen. It takes a lot longer than I ever imagined. So I have set these standards for myself, and then I'm constantly behind on those standards. And if you're the person like me, that's a little stressful. So those are the things that keep me up at night.
And I would reiterate, I really appreciate that Sabine is here to share this, because she's been through this several times. I've always advocated that it's really important not to undersell the later phases of these conversions. To go in with eyes open, to set expectations with the management, with everyone. If they know from the beginning that you're going to be asking for this stuff, it's a lot easier to get it when you need it, rather than if you suddenly realize, oh wait, we're going to need more writer cycles, and management thinks we're done. That's a really hard battle to fight after a conversion. But if you set that up at the very beginning, and everybody goes into it with eyes open, knowing that you're going to be asking for this, and this is on the agenda or on the schedule, this becomes a lot easier. So I really appreciate you sharing this for those of us who have not done this before.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I really appreciate getting to see even the sort of static screenshots of Harmonizer, because it's making me excited, because I see that it's been iterated it's been iterated since the last time that I saw it. I'm like, ooh, that's even plainer, that's even easier, that's even, right? So remember, the operationalizing things really are only as good as your ability to do it quickly and efficiently. And so looking at that, it's like that's come a long way.
Great, well, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, let's bring this home,
Let's go
shall we?
bring on the questions.